This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, the Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is the Beirut Banyan. You are the first guest in a very long time that I've had on the podcast who's from the Free Patriotic Movement. I've had many former members of the party, but in terms of an official position and somebody who has served in the state and belongs to that party currently, you're the first. And to be frank, you're the person I wanted to speak with the most. Thank you. And these are selfish reasons. I enjoy watching you on TV. I actually turn to you often to try to understand better the wider picture of not just where the party stands, but in a way trying to look back in time a bit and project forward. I think you offer some healthy terrain when you're analyzing events. And they're usually in debate shows, but I like the more measured debate shows. And my favorite one right now is Banyan 2030. And I watched you recently. And actually that made me want to reach out to you directly. I'll also say that during a campaign season, anyone that gives me their time, especially the last 2 weeks prior to elections, for me it's an honor. So I'll say that up front.
Thank you.
We met twice, and I don't know if you'll remember this. The first time I met you in person was at my father's funeral, December 27, 2013. And of the thousands of people that were in that line shaking hands, almost a trance-like situation, I shook your hands and I recognized you, and it was a quick hello goodbye. I think a few weeks later, Ziad Baroud invited me to his home, and I ran into you in the elevator. I think you were leaving. You were heading out, and I was heading in, so we probably saw him at the same time. Well, I'm not sure why we were both there right at the same moment, but I saw you. 5-second hello goodbye. Since then, it's been on social media, television, and news, and I think it's my fault for aging so badly the last 8 years, and you look the same. And we're about a decade apart, but you look good for 50. I look bad for 40. There's another side to this. I've had explorations with guests that don't really match the audience's expectations, and for me, they've been a very healthy learning exercise. And I want this to be something like that. This is not meant to put you on the spot. This is not confrontational. It's really trying to understand you better, the party better, and to be frank, where things are moving. So, with your permission, I want to go back in time before we get into what's happening right now. I had an episode with the Ukrainian ambassador to Lebanon a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the protests in Maidan, the Ukrainian protest movement, the flags that were flown in the middle of Ukraine, in the middle of Kiev in 2004, and the color, orange. And it immediately took me back some 2 decades ago to where this all began, when the Free Patriotic Movement chose the color orange as an inspiration from what was happening in Ukraine. And I think it's not an accident that more recently, Ukraine is still in the same sort of dynamic security disaster for that country. I think we're still stuck in time. So that color, I think, has transcended in a way. That color is associated with the Free Patriotic Movement, but I like learning and remembering where this all started. And my fondest memories are the buildup to the Syrian withdrawal. Those delicate weeks and months where members of this movement, which was turning into an official political party, were very, very proud. In my conversations with everyone in this country and with Lebanese abroad coming home, there was a real sense of joy that a former general, the current president, was coming back. And this was the most popular party I could think of back then, when it came to what I thought of as an opposition group. Things have changed so much in the last 17 years. So I want to pick up from that point, and we'll go slowly and we'll go gently. Between 2004 and April 2005, when the Syrian withdrawal happened, is that how you remember the buildup to Syria's exit? And how you remember March 14, 2005? Even though that word has changed over time, the meaning has changed over time. And do you think of it as still holding on to something that was really built slowly and delicately, mostly from abroad, but it was taken back to Lebanon, and it cemented itself in Lebanon's political sphere? So I'll let you say whatever you'd like. I don't want to be too romantic. I'm sorry if I am being a bit too romantic, but it's a very, very important part of our history. Whatever you can say.
Well, I think this is part of my history that I'm proud of, because, and it culminated in 2005, March 14, 2005. But for us as FPM, it was every March 14 since 1990 that we're celebrating as the memory of the war of liberation against Syrian occupation, which means that it's a continuous effort and activism that we had during 15 years, and that ended in March 14, 2005, which was one of the most wonderful days in my political life. I was part of it, I was there, and I believe it was a great reunion for the Lebanese people from all sides to express their will for freedom, for sovereignty, for independence. And it happened a few months later, actually. And this was great, and it was a historical achievement. And we can call it the second independence, definitely, because it has been 30 years maybe that we were under the Syrian occupation, or almost 30 years. So this was great. This was great part of my political life. I remember it. I'm proud of it, and I think that it marked me definitely. And I think that because I'm one of those politicians who they didn't come up to politics accidentally. It was part of a long road and build up to reach what we reach today. And therefore, I believe that I had a cause, actually. I was a young student, and I was attracted by this cause. I fought for it. I lived it every day of my life.
Yeah.
I was passionate about it, and I lived it passionately. And definitely since 2005 and the comeback to Lebanon after the exile, it was another era starting, actually. And with different challenges, as hard as the other one, differently, and with lots of disappointments, lots of good things and bad things. And I believe that this gave me a big experience, actually, a better knowledge of the system, of the people, and sort of a certain maturity compared to a little bit naivety I had at the beginning, where I believed that once the country is liberated, everything will be fine. And actually, it turned out that it was even more difficult than before.
It's quite important that your exact description of that moment leading up to the Syrian withdrawal in April 2005, but the build-up, that slow and euphoric moment on March 14, 2005, is exactly the way I remember it. And I think if we find a way one day to look back at that moment, I think there's something that's so perfect about Lebanese across the political spectrum standing together, calling on the Syrians to leave, and then how quickly the narrative shifts. I'm going to go slowly and gently down to that shift. My first major political disappointment in my political understanding of Lebanon, and I'll emphasize, I am a decade younger than you. You must have been in your early 30s back then, in 2005. 2000.
Yeah.
I was in my early 20s, so I'm allowed to be...
34. I was 34.
34. I was 24. And I'm allowed, I think, I'm given permission to make more mistakes in my calculations than you, only because a 20-year-old should be allowed to do that. But I recall a major disappointment, and it's not something that I think any of us expected on March 14, 2005. That summer's national unity. That summer's so-called national unity. That very that unpleasant unity where you have paralysis by design. Opponents that don't see eye to eye suddenly joining hands after a major shift in geopolitics, local politics. And I recall having immense sympathy for any party that did not want to take part in that kind of forced unity. So I think it's fair to say that the first attempt at having a noble opposition to that ongoing paralysis post-Syrian withdrawal was the Free Patriotic Movement. And I think it gained a lot of sympathy for standing alone, almost holding the higher ground. It still baffles me that less than a year later, one of the strangest security arrangements or deals or whatever you want to call it, the Mikhael Agreement, it still baffles me that happened less than a year later. I still can't process that moment. I know a lot has been said. I know you've said, I think hours has been said, if not more. But when you look back now, not at the calculations made then, but in hindsight, in 2022, is there any reflection and any reckoning that decision may have contributed to consequences that were not seen back then? And I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. The other tone would be worst decision made in Lebanon's history. I don't subscribe to that kind of tone. I'm trying to understand if there's any sort of, not lessons learned, but that maybe that made sense then, but it doesn't make sense long term.
Why do you want people to accept the quadripartite agreement in 2005 between these two sides that you described as nothing unite, whatever, and at the same time you want to demonize. I mean the Mikhael Agreement.
I don't want to demonize. It's not that. I want to understand more in terms of that.
Let me just so let's start by saying that joining the country together after the earthquake of the assassination of the late Prime Minister Hariri was a wise decision.
Was a wise decision. Bringing the country together. Again. Not politically, because politically it was very badly implemented, because it was sort of a power sharing, excluding major parties like the Christians from the agreement. It was supposed to be a national unity. So are you referring to the 2005 elections?
Yes.
The national unity government?
No. The 2005 اتفاق الرباعي, what is called the اتفاق الرباعي.
The outcome of that.
So the idea of, after this earthquake happening, bringing the country together again, because of the very sensitive division around it, was a wise decision. What was wrong, that it was an opportunity for the country to restart on a new basis after the Syrian withdrawal from the system and the comeback of the Christians to the political arena, let's say. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely badly implemented, and actually it was not as, let's say, as sincere as it was supposed to be, because this is why it collapsed 1 year later, or 1.5 years later. What led to the Mikhael Agreement was driven by two motives. The first one, you have to put it in the context and what is the dynamic that led to it. There is a national dimension and the political one. So the national dimension is driven by the fact that we should avoid isolating any community. So we should always keep bridges between each other as Lebanese. And therefore, we shouldn't let the Shia feel that they are isolated, that everyone wants their head, internally, externally, because this could lead to a sort of a civil war. So the idea was to give a hand, and at the same time, it was supposed to be a general. It was not supposed to be exclusively with them. It was for the others.
Right. Yeah.
And it was announced during the announcement of the agreement. The second one was political, and it was also a consequences of the way what's so-called March 14 coalition excluded the FPM, marginalized the FPM, despite the great performance the FPM did in the elections, with the great representativity General Aoun and the FPM got in these elections.
And the first real try politically for this group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of recognizing this status, they excluded the FPM from the government, and then later on they left them with no choice than going to look for political alliances elsewhere in order to restore some balance of power in the system. Because when we were alone in the opposition at that time, although we were representative with a block of 20 MPs, that was supposed to be 40 if it was a different electoral law, with the number of votes we got at that time.
Yeah. Somewhere between 20 and 40 at least, for sure.
Yeah. So we were underrepresented, and therefore we were left alone. The quadripart the اتفاق الرباعي put the government in place. They led. So politically, forget all the other dimension of the problem.
Sure.
Politically, we had the right to seek for alliances in order to change the balance of power in the system, to be able to be more effective and push our agenda. So these are the two motives or motivations that were behind the agreement.
I appreciate you saying something which is easy to forget, and I think as time passes, we too often forget very important moments for communal anxiety in this country. That, and you said it in very blunt terms, and it's real. The Christian community in Lebanese politics was not present for almost 15 years. If you include the civil war, that's 3 decades. And there was real disengagement from the most important players, whether it was the Free Patriotic Movement or the Lebanese forces, or for that matter, the Kataib party, which was best represented by the Syrian regime in those years, in the 90s. So that natural representation was unavailable. I think that's important to emphasize. I'm glad you did that. Another thing is that this movement did emphasize the Syrian problem in Lebanon, the Syrian regime in Lebanon. But for me, as somebody who's not in the group and somebody who saw it from the outside, in Lebanon, not abroad, I remember it as being a stalwart for Lebanese independence, and probably the only group that was as vocal of those concerns. I don't think any other group even matched the Free Patriotic Movement. So the reason I kind of made it, I don't want to demonize it. On the contrary, I will take it one step further only. The reason it baffles somebody like me, let's say, who's watching this group enter the political arena, could be possibly represented by almost a third of MPs with that electoral law reconfiguration, that it doesn't stay in noble opposition, that it sides with a group that is best represented under Syrian disorder as the party that best preserved a security problem, and it almost lines up naturally with the Syrian regime's politics in Lebanon. I guess the baffling point is 9 months after the elections, the FPM is no longer that attractive opposition. It's that sided opposition with a group that I don't think of as an opposition party to the regime. I'm being extra careful here because I know it's probably the most sensitive point on this whole terrain. But as I'm trying to explain it from somebody who's not thinking of the political calculations from within, more in the.
I agree, but I mean, at that time, it was no more being with the Syrian regime or not. The Syria was out, and we were very clear since the liberation war in 1989 and 90 that the day Syria will go out from Lebanon, we will not have any problem with that. We have a problem with Syria in Lebanon, not in Syria. So after the Syrian withdrawal, our concern was local. It was not anymore Syrian or external. The seeking understandings, local understandings, without all this regional dimension of Hezbollah or the other aspects, was part of the political game. Hezbollah is an internal player. They have their parliamentary bloc. They have their popular support. They are one of the players on the arena. They are the Shia representatives. So it's normal that you look for understandings and try to find common grounds with others, even if they are different in many sorts with you. It goes also with the others, not only with Hezbollah. At that time, the others they rejected the FPM. So the only way left was politically is to go and seek other alliances. But it was not as seen as if it's in favor of Syrian regime or not, because it was no more on the table, the Syrian presence in Lebanon. So the motivations were different. The internal thinking, of course, you have other reasons that.
No, sorry. Sorry. I should have. I'll clarify. The internal thinking, was there any common thread in what Hezbollah was inheriting from the Syrian departure when it came to that decision? So, I mean, in other words, did internal decisions really separate Hezbollah's institutional capabilities from Syria? Was there these are two separate things, we can work with Hezbollah?
Regardless of Syria?
Yeah.
I don't think the Syrian regime was anymore the lead threat at that time. And if you go now 17 years back, I mean, we have the burden of the regional conflict, but the driving force of these regional powers are Iran and the Saudis and the Americans, and it's not really Syria now, especially after 2011.
Sorry, I meant more in what Hezbollah was capable of doing in Lebanon, comparing to what the Syrians could do when they were here in Lebanon. I'll give an analogy. I remember these passionate discussions in Martyrs Square on March 14, 2005. They were all with Free Patriotic Movement members. And it's easy to forget that everyone was sort of hugging each other, and now no one talks to another. This is maybe one of those rare occasions where people still talk. The chance for 1559, UN Security Council Resolution 1559, I always associated that resolution with General Aoun, President Aoun's lexicon, his language, his determination. A demand for Syria to leave not only, but a demand for all sub-state militia to disarm. And I always thought of that with the Free Patriotic Movement. I don't know if that's a fair assumption. I don't think it's only the Free Patriotic Movement that stood up for that, but they were the defenders of that resolution. So, I'm trying to understand, was Hezbollah did it develop in a way that made more sense to the Free Patriotic Movement, that there could be this kind of understanding and we could sideline certain things that we stood for?
It's a mix of definitely direct dialogue, try to discuss the differences, and there were a lot, and try to find answers to them. And this was part of the 10 points, let's say bullet points in the MOU. And it's also so because you start from a point that you have to find common grounds with your partners in this country. You are part of a political system, confessional political system, where you need, in order to run the country, to find common grounds with the others. Even if the starting point with the others is so far, so conflictual. So you have to find a way to find understanding. The second one, of course, is also we had, let's say, a concourse of political interests that led together because we were looking for rebalancing the power in the country and the decision. We were excluded after the 2005 elections. We needed to shift the balance of power, or at least to make a minimum of balance in order to be able to push forward our agenda of coming back as Christian representativity in the system, changing the electoral law of 2000 that was used in 2005, that was unfair and led to an underrepresentativity of the FPM and the Christians, etc., etc. So you have to put it in the context of, let's say, as a political party who was 15 years in the exile, struggling for the independence, and then another 15 years struggling for coming back or bringing back this community to where it should be as partner in the decision-making process. So this was the fight the second 15 years until 2016.
You mentioned something that resonates with me. You said that when you also sort of entered the political scene post-2005, when you became part of this, you became part of the movement politically, that you said that there was a bit of naivete as somebody who was wanting things to happen and then they didn't happen.
Definitely.
I'll ask you something I would never have the chance to ask you otherwise. Is part of this sectarianism, meaning that there is a reality to the way Lebanon is governed? There is a sectarian component that cannot be dismissed. And my memory of the Free Patriotic Movement, even though it's obviously predominantly Christian, but pre-2005, I didn't think of that group that way. I thought of it as a national struggle.
Because we were mainly vocal on the liberation of Lebanon.
Right.
And after, when you came back to the system, and we saw that the Christians are marginalized in the confessional political system, this is a fact. I don't like it, but it's a fact.
Yeah.
So we had to be vocal on this fixing this Christian representativity and partnership in the political system. So this is why I think that we should have done it also if it was a Muslim faction that was also underrepresented or being marginalized. So because as far as we are in this confessional system, it's healthier to have good representativity of the different communities rather than leaving a group feeling that is marginalized, and especially by the others, which lead to a sort of discord in the national unity, and this is dangerous for our unity. So I guess that we were also pushed for this, putting this priority at least, because again, it was one of the mistakes of the post-2005 elections, and let's say that all the other components respected what came out of the polls in 2005 in terms of the representativity of the FPM, despite the unfair electoral 2000 law, and gave this FPM what it deserves as partner in the system. I think the whole dynamic would have been different.
I know it's being hypothetical, but had that quadripartite, whatever it's called, the four-way national unity, had that not happened, had the FBM been a fairly represented part of that larger sphere, do you think the Mikhael Agreement would have still happened?
In terms of FPM being as not siding against the Shia, yes, but not necessarily maybe being in an alliance.
Right.
But not being definitely part of a group targeting them or isolating them and wanting to get rid of them. So we could have been not necessarily in an alliance, but our positioning would have been also in a sort of a medium or peaceful way position.
Right. Okay.
I think that maybe now I cannot come back to retrospectively but let's say that let's say that the March 14 wouldn't have treated this FPM this way, and also our politically, and at the same time not trying to isolate the Shia the way they did, as part of also concerns that it was also part of the international scheme or whatever. So this, whether it's right or not, whatever, it was a perception. I don't want to make a trial of intention, say, but I'm just describing the perception that was there. I think that the FPM would have stayed maybe in the middle and tried to be the bridge between the two camps instead of being labeled as ally of a camp against the other.
You thought you could see it as still staying that noble independent opposition.
Yes, they could have been.
Again,
but it was, it would have required that the March 14 also build different relationship with the FPM. But when you isolate the FPM this way, you marginalize it. You leave it without. You still marginalize also this Christian representativity that was part of the new combat we had, let's say, in the system. Well, we have to find our way. When all the doors are closed, well, we have to find a way forward, and this way forward was through this alliance.
I think I could.
This is the political side, because I said there was also a national dimension to avoid the civil war.
I mean, I won't push any further because I think there's a lot more that's worth exploring. But I'll just suggest something. You can say completely you think it's out of line. I don't know. I don't subscribe to this threat of civil war, and I know it's used a lot, and I know people believe this too. I think the average citizen always thinks this could potentially happen, and the reason I'll say something outlandish like that, which it's a bit sort of exaggerated, maybe. Is because I think the disorder that emerged once the Syrians left is a disorder that guarantees paralysis rather than civil war. And
I mean, whatever, but that could lead at some point to a civil war. But I don't know.
I'll suggest something here, and I'll sort of cherry pick. So we
and
don't.
Also, let me just say something to be fair. In 2014, November 21 for the 2014. General Aoun was still in exile. 2004.
Yeah, 2004.
Excuse me. Was still in exile. Wrote a letter and charged us here as FPM
up and coming.
To go see the political leaders and hand over this letter. This letter said that I remember I went to see some of the leaders.
Yeah.
Because we split in groups, actually.
I'm coming back.
No,
I'm joking.
No, this was not it's known, and the letter is public.
No, I'm kidding.
That we are going towards, it was in November 2004.
Okay.
We are going towards the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon. It was part of his analysis of what was happening after 2003, or Iraq War, after the 1559, after what he did in the Congress, etc. For the Syrian Accountability Act.
The Bristol meeting is starting.
Exactly. So we are going through that. Yeah. And it's important that we have a dialogue about this transitional period where we will shift from the occupation towards being left alone altogether. This was the idea, let's say.
Right.
That this transition period, we should agree on it. Okay? At that time, he had the vision in November 2004 to say that this is happening and we have to prepare this withdrawal.
Yes.
Because we need to agree on many things before we're left alone, let's say. Before we anticipate, let's say. And actually, he was seeing it coming. And I don't know who took it seriously or not at that time, but the idea was that when you shift from this occupation or mandate or whatever you can call it, what you want to call it, tutelle or whatever.
The 15 years of Syrian,
Yes.
let's call it mismanagement.
Well, it was definitely mismanagement, but I mean, just to say, we are shifting from a country managed or let's say controlled by a foreign country.
Yes.
And with all the problems and etc. we have all already together, and then you're shifting to suddenly to Hala. At that time, the arrangement that was made for this transition, it was without us, was the quadripartite arrangement. Actually,
yes.
He was looking for something else at that time. He was looking for something, and the whole dynamic of Hezbollah, etc., March 14 would have been different, actually. Okay, you're going to tell me the Prime Minister Hariri was assassinated later, okay, but, I mean, still at that time, and there was also a delegation that went to see the Prime Minister Hariri. At that time, the idea of we have to prepare a transition between the Syrian occupation and the Free Lebanon was important so that we Lebanese agree on the period to come. And we didn't, and we missed it. And they did it through the quadripartite alliance that actually also collapsed a year later.
Right. I'll cherry pick there's a stretch of time that I think it would take like 5 hours to get into. I'm going to cherry pick events so that we can fast forward to more recent events. In my mind, and you tell me if you see it the same way, you may see it completely different. The failures that emerged from that bad idea, the June 2005 national unity, the major obstacles that were handed to that bad idea, I don't think is the bad idea's fault. And I'll give you an analogy here. A year and 3 or 4 months after March 14, we have a July war that devastates the country. That is, I think, less to do with that 2005 bad idea and more to do with the reality that increases over time, which is Hezbollah's capabilities to dictate certain policies in Lebanon. I'll go a step further. The protests that the FPM took part in, that was not really, I think, in its inception meant to lead to a street battle or mini, whatever you want to call it, flirtation with civil war in May 2008. I don't think that was the intention. But the paralysis that ensued after and the street fighting that did happen in May 2008, I think has less to do with what that kind of group did to the FPM and has more to do, I think, with Hezbollah's capabilities. Those few sovereign attempts at tackling Hezbollah's infrastructure in 2008 was met with bloodshed on the streets of Beirut. Go to 2009, another round of elections that misinterpretation of March 14, let's say, reemerges in Parliament. It's a different March 14. Obviously, the FPM is not there, not on that side. So it's a different March 14. A year and a few months after, the Prime Minister is sent away. The government falls. Now, I don't think the government fell because of anything to do with Lebanon's inefficiencies. I really still think the moment the special tribunal became a concern, a real concern for Hezbollah, that government is collapsing. And I think the years thereafter, leading up to many things that happened in the middle, this includes President Aoun's return to Baabda, I think has less to do with us and more to do with Hezbollah. And not Hezbollah, the political party, Hezbollah, the machine that dictates too much in this country. Now, I said a lot there, and I don't mean to make it so blurry, but did anything of what I just said stick with you? Or does it all sort of seem like a different planet that I live on?
No, I mean, Hezbollah is an influent player in Lebanon. But it's not the only one, let's say. And let's say that he played it better than his opponents, let's say. If you want to do, I'm talking here politics, I'm not talking the regional part. This doesn't mean that he was the only party that has influence in this country. Maybe he's a blocking force, definitely, like all parties, and he used it better than others, let's say. But because every community has a veto power. But at the same time, they were more effective, let's say, and they were more loyal to their allies, and they played it better than the others. I mean, this is why there has been mistakes. Definitely, I mean, no one didn't do mistakes in the last 15, 17 years. And we all have lessons to take from all what happened, and also from the bilateral relationships we had. And we have been vocal about we need to review a lot in this understanding because it doesn't respond anymore to the actual challenges, and we're sincere about it. At the same time, I believe that the only way forward is to bring everyone on this common ground. You have to find it. This play field where everyone should meet. Hezbollah has efforts to do in order to. It's not only attracting people to his ideas. He has also to do efforts in order to join the others, and because the rules of the game to live together and to have a country that works and the system that works needs concessions and needs deliverables from everyone. And Hezbollah is one of the most important players here, and they have to do much more efforts in order for things to happen, to improve in the country. So in that sense, you have, at the same time, you have to accept that you cannot. You have to accept the idea that they are part of the players, and you cannot deprive them from this right of being one of the decision makers in this country. Not alone, but one of them.
I'll try to use my independent mind here and apply it to something that's across the board. For me, Harakat Amal is a complicated party to perhaps lean on when it comes to inspiration. But the Harakat Amal of the early, mid, late 1970s at most is something that I think did inspire a lot of Lebanese across the board. And I think there are particular figures that are almost considered now national figures. That's going back almost half a century ago. But Harakat Amal is old. The Future Party is newer. It's a largely post-Civil War group that becomes a political party, really, like the future Free Patriotic Movement after 2005. But for me, the Future Party is far more attractive when Saad Hariri is not prime minister. And I think of somebody inheriting a status as an opposition figure when they're not the face of it. For me, it's a more appealing voice, even with less influence. For me,
opposition is always attractive.
Absolutely,
it's easy.
Yes. You're absolutely right. I apply the same thing to whether it's President Mikhael Agreement today.
Definitely, when he was in Rabi, it was much easier.
Rabi, or even
or in Paris,
or even in April when he returns, and May and June, defiant, very defiant at times, but I still lean on that voice more when they're the upper hand in opposition. But the reason I'm laying it out this way is because I don't think these figures intentionally wanted to find themselves in a situation where they all become, over time, Hezbollah's preferred communal leaders or communal alternatives like Nabih Berri. And I'm saying it in a very broad way, but I think of Saad Hariri as Hezbollah's preferred prime minister, even when he's not here. Although Saad Hariri, I think, is meant to be that voice of moving on from Hezbollah's weapons. He becomes Hezbollah's preferred prime minister. I don't know if this is true. I assume it's true. You can tell me I'm wrong. I think of Mikhael Agreement as Hezbollah's preferred president in Baabda, or preferred communal leader, I think is a better way of describing it. And Nabih Berri.
Let me tell you something. Hezbollah might have his preferences. It's his right. Every party has its preferences. Maybe the FPM has a preferences for prime minister and his preferences for speaker.
Yeah.
Hezbollah is also a political party who can have his preferences.
But those are
But
not,
he cannot.
Yeah.
He cannot choose who's the leader of a community. It's the community who chooses leaders.
Exactly.
He supports them or not. This is different.
You're right.
But he's not creating the leadership for Mikhael Agreement. He's not creating the leadership for Saad Hariri.
Yes.
It's the supporters of Mikhael Agreement or Al Hariri who are making him a leader.
I agree with you.
Okay, Hezbollah, among the leaders that are there, has his preferences. Fine.
No, I'll say it in a different way. I think they don't shine the way they were meant to shine because of a burden placed on them, which is Hezbollah's capabilities. So I think, in other words, President Mikhael Agreement is not the same president that I imagined in 2005. He's a more complicated president today. Saad Hariri is...
The system is complicated also.
Yeah.
It's the context is different than 2005, but also the system is complicated. Because being in opposition is something, and being responsible for getting things being done in such a complex system where the consensus becomes paralysis.
Yeah, yeah.
Where the productivity is so low
Yeah.
and the paralysis is so high. So this is where, and this is something that I think we underestimated, or let's say we overestimated our capacity to change it. Or maybe we could have changed it with better relationships, but political relationships. But the deterioration of the political relationships led also to complicating the task of getting things done, because you cannot get things done even if you are a president of the republic. It turned out, and even if you have all this weight we had politically, as far as you are in a consensual system that doesn't work on majority and minority, it works on its one side, one single side, with a veto power, who doesn't want this to happen. With this veto power, he can stop it, whatever weight you have in the system. And this is a political problem for any other president and from any other executive power, as far as we don't find solution for it. And this is one of the things that actually we had to confront, and was part of many of the things that obstacles that we faced and that led to some failures.
I wish I had the better words to describe a feeling that's, I don't think disappointment is the right word. And I don't mean this in particular to the Free Patriotic Movement. It's more that I think what many of us saw happening once the Syrians left turned into a nightmare that I don't think enough of us, some of us do better at this, some of us don't, enough of us articulate exactly what that machine has done to our politics. And the machine, I think, is still a security problem left over from the Syrian withdrawal. Using the word Hezbollah, maybe it dilutes it a bit because it assumes that it's just Lebanese living in certain regions that vote for Hezbollah. It's not that. It's the security reasons why President Mikhael Agreement had to leave this country, why Rafiq Hariri was killed, and we even know who Saad Hariri is to begin with, and why someone like Nabih Berri, who I have no idea how old he is now, but he's still, at this very late stage in life, Hezbollah's preferred alternative. And I think this is a disorder that has costed this country so much. And I always thought, and I am sorry to say this over and over, that that magical moment we both know too well, there was one party that I thought would actually stand high above, even if it meant less visible politics, less visible power. I really thought it was the Free Patriotic Movement. And you said it right. To be in the system, to have agency in the system, you end up in a very complicated situation. You're right. But I don't know, independent-minded opposition movements, to me, are what resonate a lot. And I'll jump ahead now. A lot of the protesters that I've met that have been on this podcast, some of them are politicians in the making. A lot of them are now running for parliament.
Elections.
I mean, they're young, they're dynamic. Some of them are a little older like me. I would say 90% are former Free Patriotic Movement members or supporters or both.
Great. We have to create an alumni.
But I don't think they want to be in that room. But I think it's something I would never get the chance to ask. In your shoes, you've seen a lot happen in this country the last 2.5 years, where many things that have been directed against this party have happened, whether it's on the street or on the news. A bit of it is aggressive. Sometimes it's using violent language. But I'm sure you have seen former supporters or even former friends, political allies that are now, they've flipped the narrative.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
This happens for all parties.
I want to ask you, though, as an individual in a party, seeing this dynamic, to you, does it simply mean that they just changed their politics and it no longer aligns itself with what you stand for? Or is it the Free Patriotic Movement has also changed its politics and it lost maybe a lot of people on the way?
It's both. It's both. Every choice you make politically might make you lose people because they're not convinced of it, and others that would join you for it. So it works both ways. You can have decisions or choices you make or alliances you make that can cost you politically, and makes you win in another way. So it's part of any political life, let's say. I don't think I think we have to. Everyone has to do his own revision of what happened, where he did well, where he did bad, and if he made mistakes or if things could have been dealt with differently. We all have to do our, let's say, autocritical evaluation, and this is normal. And many things could have been done differently. This is the way it goes for the political parties, and the events in Lebanon were not minor, let's say.
Yeah.
There was always big decisions to make, and I think that ultimately, when you deliver and when things get better, you can reconciliate with people you lost.
Let me ask you about exposure. I think there are individuals that were targeted politically by the protest movement because they were perhaps too visible when it came to the eventual collapse. I think Saad Hariri is a casualty of that kind of uprising, and he was the face of the government in 2019. Weeks later, he's resigned. Forget his delicate attempt at trying to return. It didn't happen. He's gone. He's in Abu Dhabi. I know you are not Gibran Basir. I know that. And I'm not going to ask you about anything other than just the facts on the ground. Do you think that is partially why he was one of those names that was emphasized on much more than other names? That it was an exposure that perhaps was too long. It is identified with a certain ministry that has collapsed on its head.
The more you had exposure before the revolution, the more you were the target of protesters.
Right.
It was this way.
Yeah.
And all those who were definitely at the front line, that had the huge exposure they had, it's normal that let's say the the payback was that
yeah.
they were the main targets of the revolution because they were those who people were seeing the most.
Yeah.
So it's part of what happened actually, and but actually after then everyone was driven.
Absolutely. But for you, and I know you're not. It's not that you're behind the scenes. You're a member of parliament. It's not that you're hiding.
No,
but I think of you as more. You're a less visible member when it comes to public discourse, and I think that's because you're never a minister.
Yeah, maybe right. Because I'm a parliamentarian. I'm not a minister.
Yeah.
The minister is usually the executive power. So
yeah.
He's an executive. The decisions are there. The main decisions that concerns people, and this is where the people usually protest against governments.
But trying to enter your mind, you're watching TV. I think all of us were probably watching it at the same time. Supporters and opponents, and everyone was just glued to the same screen. When you heard those chants echoing, and sometimes it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, what is the initial reaction you felt? And despite the name calling, forget the vulgarity, just the.
No. First, at the beginning, you have to understand that there's a general protest toward the political class. Forget the details and how things were driven or directed or whatever. When you are in power and there's a popular protest, you have to expect that people will react against you. Regardless of the way they did.
Yeah.
It goes to everyone in power. It doesn't spare anyone.
Yeah.
But it's normal because people, when they have to complain, they want to complain for those who are in the positions of responsibilities.
Right.
And then at that time, it's more passionate. It's more, there's no objectivity. It's كلهم this kind of instincts that drives these kind of movements.
Yeah.
And this is first you have to let it go, let them let's say empty all they have on their minds, on their hearts, and you have to accept at the beginning. You have to leave space for people to express what they want, because at this time there is no reason, there is no clear mind, there is no objectivity. It's only hatred and it's only passion and it's only anger, and it's whatever you want. And then with someone when he's in this state of mind, he's not someone who can you talk with in a normal way, because whatever you say, they don't want to listen. They just want to talk and to scream and to shout. But when things cool down a little bit, then you needed to have a conversation or a dialogue with these people, because the protest itself is legitimate.
Yeah.
People disappointment from this system is legitimate. People disappointed from corruption in the country is legitimate. People asking for a better productivity of their government is legitimate, etc., etc., etc. So the idea is good. The performance was not always good because it was mixing everyone. It was anyway. I don't want to come back to that, but Anna personally, I was happy with because if you are a real reformist in this system, if you're not part of any kind of corruption or any kind of or you don't like the way that things doesn't happen because there's always problems, the system is too much, it's too heavy, etc. You should be happy when you have, let's say, someone like helping you put the pressure. You put it yourself as part of the system inside your institution, your party, whatever.
Yes.
But when you have such a push to force politicians and political class and political parties to go forward with reforms, with fixing things, etc., it's always good. I didn't feel it as against me, as the spirit of the revolution. Then it turned political, etc., and it was more driven against or directed against the FPM mainly. Which was a little bit.
And could you add just a bit on that? In other words, when you saw that the focus shifted more let's say, a certain time towards whether it's an individual or the group itself, was there any reckoning within you that maybe there's a different way of approaching politics down the road that would serve us better?
Yeah. You have to make a revision of all the mistakes or why this anger built up happened.
Could you perhaps, just a quick sort of
But you have also to
example.
understand that regardless of what you did, the only fact that you are in the front lines, President of the Republic, the highest position you can get in this country, having so much this weight in the system, you have to expect that the anger will be driven against you naturally, spontaneously first. And then, of course, after it was also partly directed also, and targeted. So could we have avoid that? I think...
or is there one thing you could think of that's maybe a step that was done that put you more in the spotlight? Other than the symbolic post, which is a very important one, the highest post. But whether or not the president was part of this party, is there anything that you could think of that perhaps put more burden on this group than other groups at certain times? Could it be maybe certain positions in government that maybe the group did not want to be in, for example? Or is it maybe a certain politics that did not resonate well?
It's a mix of that. Yani, definitely we had something wrong happened, yani, and but I still find a little bit unfair that the FPM has the biggest part of targeting, let's say. I could have explained it by the fact that he has the biggest weight in the system politically. He was the president of the Republic. But then it turned out with the political parties infiltrating the revolution that it was more than that.
I see. So you see it as many things that contributed. I'll get to the elections, and I'll save the best for last. But there's another point that I wanted to ask you, and I would have asked you this had we not done this. This would have been a friendly exchange, maybe, and I would ask you because it's a rare opportunity for somebody who fought for Lebanon's independence 17 years ago and earlier to be in Lebanon, to be in this country when the largest non-nuclear blast happens. The most devastating explosion anyone could ever dream of in Beirut. And maybe you'll disagree with this, but I think it's more or less taken for granted now that this ammonium nitrate was not here for domestic concerns. This is a regional war being fought in Lebanon. And I think it's safe to say at this point that the regional war that's being fought in Lebanon has less to do with our inefficiencies or sectarianism, and has more to do with that neighbor to the east that this group fought against to get out of Lebanon. And there's an obvious indirect responsibility that is clear, and it tore Beirut apart. This group wanted the Syrian regime out, and an alliance done with a group that thinks of itself as defending the Syrian regime next door and then sends fighters to protect that regime. And Beirut blows up. How do you see that event in terms of where the FPM once stood against the Syrian regime?
But why are you getting into conclusions with regards to the ammonium before the Judge Bitar issue his decision? Because someone is inquiring what happened.
7 months ago, that investigation was forced to come to a breakdown paralysis.
It will continue, but I mean, why are you getting into conclusions as for the ammonium context? I don't know. I personally, I'm an MP.
Yeah.
I heard lots of scenarios.
Yeah.
Like you, but I'm not adopting anything before the Judge Bitar issue his own investigation, let's say, result or whatever.
I can't think of any other group wanting Judge Bitar to prevent a full investigation.
I don't think anyone can hide what happened. Sooner or later is going to come out. You cannot hide. There is two aspects. Aspect of the ammonium coming to Lebanon. Did it come accidentally, like the way the course of events happened, or it was intended to be this way? Then the way it was stored 7 years, the way it was stored, why there was no response to the warnings that were issued by some responsibles, and then finally, what happened really the day of the explosion? Was it an accidental fire, or it wasn't there are lots of questions, and
I agree with you.
I heard a lot.
Yeah.
I heard a lot.
I agree
and
with
I really
you.
don't want to jump into conclusions because it's a very sensitive issue.
You're right, but there's one group that has prevented full sovereignty in this country since Syria's withdrawal. And there's transit points, there's infrastructure, there's a port, there's an airport, there are borders. And there's one group that is capable of doing things no other group can do.
Let's wait for Judge Bitar. I don't think he's a big sympathizer of this group.
Yeah.
And therefore, and vice versa. And vice versa. So let's wait for his conclusions before commenting. You want me to comment something? I'm not. It's one of the scenarios that you have in mind. But
No,
how can I adopt it and just comment on it? I mean, let's wait for the conclusions and then we talk about it.
I think it's the tragedy that we all understand the situation and we put the onus on investigations that never happen in Lebanon. And they don't happen because one group's capabilities prevent due justice from happening.
I think that no one can hide what happened. Honestly, no one, no one. Even if now there is these issues about resuming the investigation with these technicals and appointees, etc. But no one. I think all the facts are known now, and no one can hide them. Now the question is about the Judge Bitar has the whole information. And I think that the issue that is preventing him from continuing is more political than, it's more related to the question of the minister's responsibility rather than the real fact behind what happened with the ammonium. This is my opinion again, and I wait for his decision.
That's the correct answer from anyone, actually, who's in, I mean, I wouldn't, it would be shocking to hear a different answer, but knowing that you're not, perhaps, it's not your place and you're right. In a country that works, you would want the investigation to wrap up, and then you could look at the report and make conclusions.
But there's already someone you can condemn is a state failure that led to leaving these, regardless who brought this ammonium and why it exploded.
Yeah.
How could these institutions fail to deal with such a dangerous storage during 7 years? This is something that you can already condemn, Yani.
But I think
then you have to go into micro and go to the personal responsibilities. But the
right.
macro responsibility is there.
But state failure has less to do with your group or any other group in this country. A proxy army capable of doing things without any pressure. And once that pressure is applied, the pressure is eliminated. That, I think, contributes heavily to state paralysis and failure. And I don't think it's only allies of that group. It's the nominal opponents. It could be groups that even scream and shout against that situation all the time. And at the end of the day, they're part of that larger problem too. But I think that's what best represents Hezbollah's disorder in Lebanon. And I wish I could hear more individual voices clarifying why they think of Hezbollah's security and arms and its capabilities as a problem. I don't hear that enough, whether it's in October 17 or the regime. But I think that's a very huge burden placed on politics in Lebanon. I won't go further on the port blast. I'll wrap it up with Baabda. I've been lucky. I've met so many candidates running in Baabda. From the opposition, two from the opposition actually, Mikhael Agreement and Khalil Agreement.
Yes.
And I'm now meeting you, running for your candidacy. I'm curious I've seen photos of you actually doing your campaigning, and I follow you on social media. And I think it's funny because I want to hear, but I can't. These are pictures. I want to know what voters are asking you about. And I'm wondering, is the average voter asking you for huge solution to regional problems when they talk to you?
Today, the priority of the people is mainly about the financial and economical situation. People are hit in their power purchase. People are hit in their savings in banks. And I think there's no priority that goes over that. So what people need now is to have a perspective and the vision of the way out, and to see the fate of their savings, and to see also how things will improve in order for them to come back to a acceptable power purchase, or with regards to the actual situation today. So definitely these elections are mainly, let's say, hijacked by this subject compared to all the other subjects that you might think of, political or regional or whatever, because there are priorities in people's life, and this is the first priority.
So it's really the local component that still matters when it comes to campaigning, that you hear mostly.
I mean, I hear it from the question of the people. This is where they are worried. They are worried about their deposits. They are worried about the lira, the devaluation. They are worried about the future economical situation,
Right.
Their work, their job, their institution, whatever it is. So this is the concern of the people today. Do you think now people are really, and for them, the political issues are not really now the top priority. Their minds are somewhere else.
But I like hearing this from multiple candidates. I actually spoke to Fouad Makhzoumi a few days ago and another Beirut 2 opponent, and they had a different outlook on Beirut 2, where there was an insertion of regional affairs into the voter dialogue, which I thought it struck me as odd that this was happening. But it is nice to see how different districts are expressing themselves, and I think it has to do with maybe communal anxiety. And you mentioned this at the beginning. Your journey into Lebanese politics, there was a community that was not fully invested in politics. I don't think it's the same story right now with the Sunni community, but I think there's a parallel, or there's an echo of that there seems to be some anxiety that reminds me of the 90s more and more when it comes to voters and why they're not voting sometimes. I'll wrap it up, Alain. You've been very kind with your time, with a very bold question. And with your permission, later on, we'll do another round to talk about other things. What would it take for you in a group, presently in politics, is going to be with us for years to come? What would it take for you to think of Iran's security in Lebanon the way you thought of Syria and Lebanon? How would you be able to come to that conclusion? What would need to happen for you to actually speak the same language that was once spoken 3 decades ago?
No, I mean, I still have the same goals and aims in order to have a country that is completely independent. I don't want the country being under any regional influence, whether it is Iran or others. So that it didn't change, actually.
What would it take for you to make that your rallying cry the way it was the rallying cry?
It's not a question of being, listen, the difference between maybe me and others, they are just more vocal, let's say. They're just telling people slogans. I think that...
You're referring to the highway, right?
No. I'm just saying that, I mean, it's not by, just slogans, etc., that you solve problems as complex as the ones we're facing. And we inherited that were here before. So it's a mix of trust building between communities. It's a mix of trust building about your intentions towards this other partner in this country. It's a mix of solving the real security issues and threats against Lebanon, and a mix of regional also problems to be also solved and fixed. So when you come to such a complex issue as the one you're raising, and that is here, it's very simplistic to say just only, just throw words just to solve it. No, it's much more complex. It's something that it's here. It has been here since a long time. It's complicated, but at the same time, you should ultimately find a solution for it. You cannot. It's an exception. It's not the rule.
Is it, in your mind, more local than
No.
regional?
It's regional more than local.
if 1559 was part of the drive to recalibrate Syria's interests in Lebanon, is that a journey you could see happening where the FPM takes on the role of doing something that it used to do quite well, which is to address Lebanon's concerns?
I solve problem in Lebanon by trust building with my partners first, so that they understand that I'm not here conspiring against them. And if I tell them about any solution, because there should be a solution ultimately, I'm saying it from a friend's position, from someone well-intentioned position, from someone who's not against and not willing to get rid of them or conspire against them. So there is a minimum of local trust building that is completely, let's say, lost these days. And secondly, you have also to be objective and realistic that you have also the regional issues to be solved. You have to be solved. So this is a process that should lead to that. And I think that we all agree that the ultimate goal is a country, is a state that's completely sovereign and that has the exclusivity of arms. And I don't think that there's no doubt about this ultimate goal that we should all have. The only thing that differs is the way to reach it.
Yeah.
And the way to reach it has to deal with the causes and the reasons behind creating this exceptional situation, so that this exceptional situation can end.
I appreciate your measured diplomatic tone when it comes to local trust and building trust among differing sides. I hope, this is my wishful thinking, that a group like the FPM could one day serve the diplomatic goals that it once served on a regional and international level as well. Because I think you did that effectively with Syria. I don't think the same happened with Iran. And I know we went into that. We explored it in depth. I'd like to do a follow-up episode with you later because I love this kind of dialogue. I really enjoy it. And I learn a lot when I do this. I know there's a lot of opposing views in this story, but this mental exercise is healthy. And I really respect you for sitting down with me. And I hope we can do this again down the road. And all I'll say is good luck with the elections. It's a very hard season for anyone from the opposition or from the regime or from different parties and individuals. I think there's a lot of work, and I can only imagine the pressure of talking to me during this pressure cooker.
Thank you.
So thank you, Alain.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.